Well, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here for this event, the second of our two programs commemorating the 10th anniversary of Katrina. And for those of you, I recognize a few who were here for our first program last week. We obviously talked there about, in part about personal stories from those who lived through the experience of Katrina 10 years ago, but in part also talking about the extraordinary response of members of this community, staff and faculty and students all together in responding to keep this institution, Tulane Law School, going in those harrowing days following the storm. The program for today is focused on the equally extraordinary response of our faculty in the wake of the storm to helping to dig into the enormous problems left in the city of New Orleans and in the Gulf Coast, spanning criminal justice, spanning environmental policy and sustainability, and politics and government, and everything in between. And it really is an amazing story for anyone connected with this place. Can take enormous pride in the way our faculty responded to try to pitch in and not only keep the city going, but to find broader lessons for the entire country and for the world beyond that could be learned from the terrible experience of Katrina. So with that, I will step out of the way and turn over the program to Professor Adam Feibelman, who's also the Associate Dean for Faculty Research, to moderate the program.
Thanks. So first, thanks to Abby for including me in the event. Dean Myers kind of given a nice substantive introduction, so my job is really just to get things started, quickly get out of the way, and keep time strictly enough so that I can maybe preserve 15 minutes or so at the end for you all to ask questions of folks. But I do have three very quick introductory comments before passing things along. First, people often ask me, what is it that law professors do when they're not actually teaching students and grading exams? And I can't think of a better way to illustrate the interesting and important things that legal academics do than this panel. Relatedly, this panel follows, as Dean Meyer mentioned, a previous one last week. The idea was last week's focused on kind of personal experiences and this on work, Katrina-related work. But I think you'll see quickly that the divide between personal and professional breaks down considerably. And again, I think this is a distinctive aspect of a lot of work that law professors do in general. Third, somewhat on that theme, I hope you'll indulge me just a quick personal reflection. Having lived here a number of years before the storm, I'm one of those people who was not living here 10 years ago, but had deep connections to this place, and who followed events here and the experience of friends or family with acute anguish, and who were drawn to move here in the aftermath of the storm to be part of what was clearly going to be an important period in the life of the city. So while my own work is not actually Katrina related in substance, I definitely feel like my day-to-day personal life, professional life, that is connected to that experience in some meaningful way. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have found a home at this institution, and honored to count as my colleagues these folks and others here and others absent who've played such crucial roles in the aftermath of the catastrophic events of 10 years ago. And with that, I'm going to pass it first to Oliver Hauk, and then each person is going to introduce themselves in the interest of time.
Are we to speak now or just introduce ourselves?
Just speak. Yeah, speak in a minute. I've introduced you, so you don't have to introduce yourself, but you'll speak for 10 minutes.
Hello, I'm Oliver Hauk. Thank you for coming. 10 years ago to this day and 5 months, students returning to Tulane and to the city were exposed to a lecture series that we put together absolutely ad hoc and on the spot in this very room. People came from all over the community. They sat up in the windowsills. They sat along the steps running down. It was a happening. Every Wednesday from 4 to 6, we had another topic. The Chief of Engineers of the Army Corps of Engineers, the President of the University on Education, Keith Medley and others on race and demographics. What happened? How did it happen? But more importantly, where do we go? All the things that now are being talked about in the national press, look at this happen, none of that was known. None of us knew where anything was going. The city was still wet. Places smell bad. And so this was sort of a think tank. And what is interesting is that every one of the segments that we picked up in that series became an agenda of the city in one way or another. It was like being inside a crystal ball. It was one of these very serendipitous events, and the students that came back were on the very front edge of it. They knew more than the reporters did. In fact, we also offered it to them for course credit. Well, how could we do that? Well, for those who wanted, we gave them a 1-credit paper assignment, but not wanting to grade 140 or 50 papers, we allowed them to do it in groups. And we had 75 papers come in, which means more than 100 students took it for credit. And I'll just remember this one paper title, and you can tell me what this could possibly be about. When I saw the paper, I picked it. I had no idea what the relationship was. It was called, "Dude, Where's My Medallion?" Anyone have any idea what that could refer to? Well, we have yes, Jane?
Yeah.
The medallion also has a commercial purpose for taxis. Your taxi permit is called your medallion. And what happened was the taxi drivers took off with the taxis and the medallions. So what do the taxi companies do? And who owns the cars now? And who owns the right to drive in New Orleans? Who would have thought such a problem could arise? Well, 2 of our students were in the taxi business, and so there it came into the class. And the eclectic nature of the interest was one of the most revealing things of that to me. But that exercise prompted me and others to write on the very things that were being talked about. Now, I'll tell you a funny thing about Katrina. Whatever you believed before, Katrina made you believe it more. It just put you on steroids. And so, if you were African American here and believed that whites were out to get rid of blacks in New Orleans, well, here's proof positive. First of all, they dynamited the levees. That was the belief. And that flooded the 9th Ward and saved, the Garden District. None of that's true, but it was believed. And if you believed that they wanted you out so badly they wouldn't let you move back in, that too, voila. And if you were white and you believed that blacks were armed and dangerous and irresponsible, well, just look at the TV. And look what was going on in the Superdome. And look, they were shooting at helicopters. None of that was true. But vitally believed to the core. It just confirmed. Passing out of here when I finally left, many days after Katrina, when the city became intolerable, I went to Mississippi and stayed with a friend for an evening. And New Orleans was on the news and in the headlines, on the television. And he looked at me and he said, "Do you understand, Ollie, why we fought the Civil War?" And I thought, holy cow. Everything he's brought up and believed in has been reinforced by Katrina in that own way, which to me was perverse, but for him was obvious. That happened to us as profs right down the road. Whether you saw it in terms of environmental pollution or criminal justice or public housing or public management and so on, it became your thing. And it became my thing, which had always been, ever since I came to New Orleans, indeed the reason I came to New Orleans in 1971 and then to teach here in 81 and beyond, was the mismanagement of the area around New Orleans that made it totally vulnerable to flooding. It's insane. We made this flood with our levees and our navigation systems coming in. Those navigation systems, Mistergo and the rest, are calling cards for hurricanes. I mean, what did you think? Sure, the hurricane would come. The oil and gas canals that knocked out the buffer was crazy. And you couldn't get any traction with that idea until it happened. And afterwards, everybody's on those ideas. It just went up in lights. And so I wrote a third article that finally got it right. And we published it in the Environmental Journal, and it's called, Can We Save New Orleans? And it's an anecdotal article. I think there'll be copies in the back if you're interested, but I'm not here to sell them. But it's just an interesting read. But I think the most interesting question in New Orleans is an existential one. Will there be a New Orleans? Can there be a New Orleans 100 years from now? And that's what this article, for the first time, broached. And as you know, it's broaching all around. So that was my piece of the action. How much time?
We've got 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, I want to brag on...
Answer whether we're going to be here.
I want to... well, I'll tell you this. I think that question is more in doubt now than it was 10 years ago. We have peed away so much time doing what we need to be done, and we failed to address so much what we should be doing that there's no saving South Louisiana. We can save New Orleans, but South Louisiana is... The seas are rising so fast. We're continuing to destroy the coast by our own actions so heavily. Get me off my soapbox. I'm leaving it. But look that's what Katrina allowed me to do, right? It gave me this soapbox to put stuff up that people would finally read and respond to. But I want to tell you about a student now. Because this not only happened to faculty, it turned on their light switches and they went beautifully out with what they were doing. But it did it for students, and I'll tell you one. I met her in Georgetown. We were both refugees from New Orleans waiting to get back in. And she said, you know, I've been hearing from my classmates and I want to write a play about this. I said, what? Mary Nagel. She says, a play. I said, okay, fine, let's do it. Like I'm a playwright, but she is. She wrote a play about student experiences through Katrina that was marvelous. And it wasn't just the student experience. She put in Wolf Blitzer and the Situation Room and everybody running around. She had a Pirandello-like cross-conversations with people that were even more illuminative than the conversation in direct. Beautifully done. We put it on here in 110, and then, by students. Students put it on. And then down at Le Chat Noir downtown, got a nice little review in the Times-Picayune. And Mary then wrote another play the next year, and we put it on. Wrote another play the next year, we put it on. Went out to clerk for a federal judge in Nebraska and put on a play in the federal district court in Nebraska about the trial of a Ponca Indian chief and the incredible decision of that court that, yes, the Ponca Indian chief was entitled to habeas corpus and relief from army arrest. Mary is part Cherokee. And then she goes on to work for, in New York City, one of the largest power plaintiff firms in the city, suing those mortgage security backers and the rest of the banks who played such hanky-panky and almost ruined the world financially. And just this last week, she wrote me and said, you know, I'm leaving. He says, I'm going to now go work for a Native American organization. I feel like I've come home. And I thought, oh, I almost cried. I thought, I'm so proud of you. So if anybody asks why people want to be professors, I tell you, for me, and I know I speak for others, it's those moments when one of you goes out and does something like this, and you feel so proud of them. And you know what? It happens every year. And you know what? most of the time you don't even know about it, but it's happening. So it's magical, isn't it? Katrina was a magical moment that lit us up. Horrible as it was, it lit us up. Thanks.
So I'm Pam Metzger. I'm going to stand because I'm incapable of talking and sitting at the same time. Oliver's right. It was a magical, horrible, amazing moment, and it lit us all up like rides at a carnival. And some people will tell you that maybe we went a little too fast. I want to talk to you about the role the law school played in reimagining criminal justice, both in New Orleans and across the state. After Katrina, some of you may have seen the pictures of the Orleans Parish Prison after the storm with thousands of men, mostly black, in orange jumpsuits on the overpass by the jail going over I-10. The storm caused the public defender's office to fail. It survived on parking tickets and fines, and after the storm there were none, so there were no paychecks and no public defender's office. And there were between 8,000 and 10,000 men, women, and children who were rescued from the Orleans Parish Prison and shipped to jails all over the state and in some cases into Arkansas. And as it turns out, the public defender's office had never bothered to keep a name or a list of names of their clients, so nobody knew who was in jail or for what or for how long. And it was really a diaspora of poor people, mostly. And in late September, early October of 2005, the chief judge of the Orleans Parish Criminal Court appointed the Tulane Criminal Law Clinic, which I was directing at the time, and Catherine was with me running the program, and the Loyola Criminal Law Clinic to represent all of the Orleans Parish prisoners. And if you do the math, that made 4 lawyers and 8,000 inmates, so 2,000 a person, seemed like a fair ratio. And we were told that it was our job to figure out what to do about thousands of unrepresented people whose names we didn't know and whose charges we were unfamiliar with, whose families didn't know where they were. And quite frankly, we were at something of a loss. I started commuting back to New Orleans in October to try and figure out what it was I was supposed to be doing, and quickly found out that the first job was trying to figure out who was in jail and for what. One group of lawyers had already gone ahead and gone out and done interviews, but those were extremely inaccurate. The numbers kept changing and prisoners kept moving. And we began what in hindsight I guess looks like a very disorganized process, but at the time felt efficient, of trying to figure out where everybody was. And to give you some perspective on what that meant, we had no power, we had no files, we had no folders, the computer systems were down. For those of you that have seen Treme, there's a scene in Treme where the sheriff hands the lawyer character a list of all the names of all the people who were in the jail. That didn't happen. We got that list in February of 2006, more than 6 months after the storm, and even then the list was wrong. So we had armies of students, both from Tulane and from elsewhere, who did nothing but come down and sit in courtrooms and go through page after page after page of records, trying to match names that sounded something like another name that might be on a piece of paper of somebody who was lost in the jail. We were responsible here at this clinic for the release of probably, it's got to be at least 2,000, between 2,000 and 3,000 prisoners within probably the first 6 months. And to talk about being lit up, it was like fish in a barrel. You could walk down to the district court. We had students who did it every day, and they just had a spreadsheet, and they'd walk into court and say, "Judge, this is a list of 379 people who've been in jail longer than the maximum sentence they could have served if they'd ever pled guilty, and they've never been to court." And it was like magic. The judge would pick up his pen and poof, from chains into freedom. And then they'd drive them back here on buses and drop them off in mid-city with $10 in check form and no ID. And so that clearly wasn't a sustainable system, and we decided we had to do something different. And so we became involved with a group of lawyers, both nationally and locally, who decided that this was the moment to reform the larger public defender system here. That had we had a functioning public defender system, you would never have had this enormous diaspora of people who were simply lost. As a result, we had students who worked on drafting the first statewide public defender bill, which was passed in 2007. We were responsible essentially for running and staffing the public defender's office, such as it was for the first 18 months to 2 years, I'd say, after Katrina. I sat on the board of the local public defender's office until it was dissolved in favor of a state public defender office. And then first Professor Hofel and then myself sat on the state board. When we did those things, we had students with us at every step of the way. We had students come to what were biweekly kumbayayas. We all met at the Supreme Court. And it was the DAs and the public defender's office and us and some police officers and Jim Letton. And we all went and we tried to hammer out what was going to happen, because we had no courtrooms and no juries and no lawyers, and there was no way to do any kind of justice. Around about November of 2006 is what I really want to tell you about, though. By that point, it was pretty clear to us that no one was coming to help. And when I say no one, we got some emails from lawyers, big firms, who wanted to come and volunteer, and these are the way the emails read. I'd like to come and try a case. It needs to be during the second week of February, and I'd like to make sure that it has at least one expert witness. I'd need to be gone by Friday and would prefer to arrive no later than Wednesday. This was not helpful. What we needed was people to print documents and staple them into files. We were down to the real crises of the system. In November of 2006, we walked a man out of jail. Students found him, who had been arrested in early September of 2005 and had never come to court, not once. The explanation we were given was that his English hadn't been good enough for anyone to understand that he'd never had a court date. So we decided that we needed to do something different, that we needed to find a way to catch all of those lost people. And we decided to launch a project using law students. And we thought maybe we'd get a few. And we asked students from other law schools to come and help, and we said, could we get a ratio of 8 to 1, 8 students to 1 supervisor, and we're going to run this project all through December and January and February, and we're going to find the last 500, 600 inmates and bring them out. And I'll never forget being in my office, and I got a phone call from the faculty at Pacific, McGeorge Law School, calling to say that they wanted to come and volunteer, and they had 17 law students and 8 lawyers. And I said, well, that's great, but that's a really extraordinary ratio. 17 students, 8 lawyers, maybe we could use the lawyers someplace else. And the guy said, no, you misunderstood me. It was 70 students. And I sat down on the floor of my office, and I just cried. Because all this time, we were waiting for the cavalry to come, and we thought it was going to be lawyers. And we thought it was going to be, White and Case and Williams and Connolly, and they were going to ride in on their white horses and do something. And it turned out that the people who really helped us change criminal justice here and who really helped us change lives were law students who gave up their winter breaks, who paid their own way, who slept in hostels, who worked in a public defender's office that had no power, and who went and all over the state to bring back stories of what had happened to these inmates. And then those stories in turn became the stories that helped us pass legislation that changed the way public defense worked. We had a student who drove from Nebraska to come here. And he arrived and he said, hello. And I said, hello, it's very nice to meet you. You have to go to Port Allen, which is not exactly a short distance. And I sent him out and away, and he comes back and he says to me, I met somebody who doesn't know why he's in jail. And I'm like, well, that's nothing new. And he said, no, I met somebody who doesn't know why he's in jail. And I checked, and he's in jail on a probation violation, and the probation expired in April of 2005. And I said, what? He said, no, April 2005. Those were the kinds of cases that we were seeing, and it was students, not lawyers. It was students who brought that news back. It was students that transformed the process here. It was students that enabled us to go to the Louisiana Supreme Court, to go to the Louisiana legislature, to go to the federal courts and say, what is happening here is profoundly wrong. It is profoundly un-American. That was always the Fox TV plug. It is unacceptable to consider this a form of any kind of justice. And while the reforms that we accomplished have been somewhat successful, we no longer fund our public defenders entirely based on traffic tickets. We no longer run parish-by-parish systems where judges control who the public defenders are. We have a public defender office that is required to actually keep lists of their clients. There's a long way to go. But that experience put this law school front and center in terms of making those changes for this community. There is not a piece of legislation in this state, there is not a criminal justice reform in this city that does not have on it somewhere the mark of a Tulane student or a Tulane professor or a Tulane alum. There is no major initiative about criminal justice that happens without someone in this law school being a part of it. Not because we are the be-all and the end-all, but because when the time came to do the work, it was this law school and our students who had their boots on the ground and who did it. It was our students who came back when they didn't have to. It was our students who stayed here in their summers. It was our students who quite literally put their money where their mouth was and chose to make a stand in this city and in this place for the rights of poor people charged with crimes. And that's enough to light anybody up for a lifetime.
Good evening. So I'm Adam Babich, and I direct the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. And for those of you who don't know, that's basically a cross between a law school class and a law firm. So it's like a law firm, and that we're organized like a law firm, like a law school class, because instead of paying our lawyers, we give them law school credit. So how we interacted with Katrina relates very much to the way environmental laws work in emergencies. And the answer is not very well, as you can imagine. And we don't always want them to work exactly the way they were drafted. So, for example, after the levee failures, and always good to bear in mind that this was largely a man-made disaster, not a big storm alone, but the Corps of Engineers who designed and built substandard levees, it failed at the key moment. 80% of the city was flooded. That water very quickly was contaminated with all sorts of substances. And of course, to just pump that water out into Lake Pontchartrain was pretty much illegal, right? And of course, that's pretty much what we did. And very few people would have said, don't do that. Right? It was an emergency. We had to get that water out of the city. And so that kind of set the tone for dealing with environmental problems post-Katrina, which was, there has been a storm, there's an emergency, nobody can expect us to comply with the law. So essentially, environmental laws seem to go out the window for a protracted period. One of the big problems we were facing, of course, was the problem of debris. All these houses that were destroyed, debris piles everywhere, and so the question is, what do you do with all that stuff? The solution that the state chose, or one of the solutions, was to issue emergency orders waiving various parts of the solid waste, hazardous waste laws, so that this debris could be quickly gathered up and put in a variety of landfills. And so here's a bit of the legal background, is that basically, this is oversimplifying a little bit, but you can divide landfills into three categories: hazardous waste, municipal waste, i.e. garbage, and then construction and demolition debris. And construction and demolition debris, which are usually referred to as C&D landfills, are the most laxly regulated in that there's not even a liner that's required to keep leachate waste from interacting with groundwater and the environment. And kind of the idea, and this is largely a fantasy anyway, but this is kind of the idea of the C&D landfill, is construction debris. What are we talking about? Oh, rebar, broken up pieces of concrete. It would be silly to put that stuff in a lined landfill. We can just put it in a landfill, it'll be fine. Now, of course, in the real world, and by the way, when you walk along the streets in New Orleans and you see all those dumpsters, or at least in Uptown, outside people's houses that they're renovating, almost certainly that stuff is destined for a C&D landfill. So when people come and dump their crawfish or their dog waste or whatever it is they're dumping in those receptacles, unless it's caught and pulled out, that's going into a landfill that's inappropriate, really, for that type of waste. So anyway, what the government did was expand. They called them enhanced C&D landfills. So they expand the definition of C&D to include asbestos-contaminated waste, waste contaminated with household hazardous waste, all sorts of stuff that was in these debris piles. The idea being, now we can just dump it into a landfill. So that was one problem. The clinic's clients, so basically we are client-driven at the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. People come to us and say, hey, we've got a problem here. Can you come up with an approach? So the clients were concerned about this because many of these landfills, as you can imagine in Louisiana, it's difficult to separate a landfill from groundwater. One of the landfills was the old Gentilly landfill, is like right on the intercoastal waterway. Very concerned about what was going into these landfills. Plus, a lot of our clients were around, so not everybody left the town for very long, and watching the kind of stuff that was going into these debris piles. As you can imagine, it was pretty much everything, right? And by the way, I was describing this to one of our defendants was describing this to a magistrate judge when we were talking about whether or not this stuff had been carefully sorted. And it was interesting, you hear you've got legal proceedings going on about something that everybody lived to a certain extent. And so the judge at one point, my defendant was making his great argument. He was really doing a good job. I was almost lost in admiration as he was describing the spotters, who would pull out inappropriate waste. Went on for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then the magistrate judge said, oh, come on, I was here. It was the wild, wild west. Nobody knows what went into those landfills, right? So we actually brought a case arguing that these emergency landfills were preempted by federal law. Case did not have a happy ending, and frankly, that's not unusual in that it's difficult to get a court to second guess government officials when the government officials are acting in the face of emergency. We've issued an emergency order. Here's somebody suing, right, saying, oh, that's preempted by federal law. But over the course of the life of the lawsuit, we negotiated down many of those hurricane orders. So we negotiated down, the geographic scope shrank, household hazardous waste came out. So even though it was frustrating to ultimately get bounced from court, we did make a lot of progress in that case. The other interesting thing that was going on, let's say I don't have very much time. The state of Louisiana opened a new landfill 1.5 miles from Village de l'Est, Vietnamese American community, one of the first communities, lower income community, one of the first communities to come back. No public comment, no permit. just opened up a landfill for this enhanced C&D waste. And so we also launched into this permit, well, there was no permit, but this challenge to the landfill, say environmental justice challenge as well. By the way, this emergency order issued in April 2006, so we're talking 7.5 months past the initial flood, that, well, we don't have time for public participation. We don't have time to talk to people about what we're doing here. So that was a protracted battle, and settled. Now, by the way, along the way, Mayor Nagin had waived zoning for this landfill as well. He pulled back that waiver, and so the landfill actually closed in August of 2006. So there were a few months of waste in there. Our final Katrina case, which we settled in 2013, was about that landfill, because part of the concern was it's going to be reopened in the next storm, right? Was an agreement from Waste Management Incorporated, which was the landfill's operator, to never reopen the landfill. And I probably got 15 seconds or something, but I mean, the question comes up when I think about this now, well, what did we learn? Possibly nothing. As a city, I mean, frankly, I think we're going to do it again next time there's a storm. I mean, there was no reform in terms of either environmental justice. I mean, it just happens to be that we opened up a new landfill in people who don't look like, in the neighborhood of people who don't look like many of us, right? And then two, while that stuff winded down slowly, there was never a realization, say, that there had to be a bright line somewhere of how far you're willing to go to stretch the rule of law in an emergency, which is, of course, a difficult question, but nonetheless a little bit frustrating. Now, you know, I learned a lot. I think our students learned a lot. Our clients learned a lot and are probably a lot more organized now than before that landfill went in. But that's my Tulane Environmental Law Clinic Katrina story.
Good afternoon. My name's Stacy Schecksteiner. I'm going to try to stay seated for this, and we'll see how that goes. I direct the Civil Litigation Clinic, and we did not represent the entire parish of displaced housing residents like the criminal clinic did. We did take on some individual cases of housing discrimination. We represented people who were trying to return to New Orleans and encountered discrimination on the basis of family status and the basis of race, finding out on the way to New Orleans with their worldly possessions, what was left of them, finding out with the car packed with kids and everything else that the landlord who had said yes was now saying no because of the fact that they had children. We represented displaced public housing residents who learned that the housing authority in that moment of chaos and crisis decided to rent public housing units that were promised to former residents to their own employees. So everyone needed a place to live, and so city workers were given some of those units instead of some of the residents who had legally enforceable preferences for those units. We're still litigating a consent decree that we reached with the Housing Authority right now because they haven't rebuilt everything they promised to rebuild. But I'm not going to talk about all those things in detail. I'm going to talk about some of the research that I've done post-Katrina. And what I've really focused on is this phenomenon or this notion that we had in the immediate aftermath of the storm that we had this opportunity to undo long-standing patterns of segregation in our neighborhoods. We had this pattern to become a more inclusive place. And this was, maybe not all of us had this vision after the storm, but some of us did. Some of us said, well, what can we do to make this region a more inclusive place? We, of course, had a high level of segregation residentially on the basis of race and income before the storm, but many places are segregated. I mean, Cleveland, and not just the South. I mean, Cleveland, Chicago, Boston, these are highly segregated places. But New Orleans had the second highest level of poverty concentration in the country before Katrina. And so we had this opportunity to undo that. But what did we do? What we saw was that we took this opportunity and we actually used it to become more exclusive in many ways. And so the writing that I did after the storm kind of documents this phenomenon of communities without very intentional planning and without enforcement of affirmative fair housing requirements. You saw government at every level maintaining the status quo of segregation, and in many instances making it more segregated, or just repeating the pattern, certainly. So just to kind of drill down on this a little bit, most of us know, whether we lived here or maybe whether we were watching from afar, that we had 5,000 households who lived in public housing at the time of Katrina, and the plans to demolish much of this housing were already underway at the time of the storm. But of course, the fact that everyone was displaced meant that the process of demolition was accelerated. And so what was already planned just began to happen on a more accelerated pace. So we had 5,000 households who were living in very segregated conditions, and the justification for the demolitions it was the segregation, it was the poverty concentration, the living conditions, and so this was justified in many ways based on fair housing concerns, but the way that we decided to help undo those conditions of segregation was to provide people vouchers, housing vouchers, and so this is a type of subsidy that's not attached to a housing unit, but it's attached to the person, or the person is allowed to travel with it. And unfortunately, at the time of Katrina, we had 50% of our rental housing was destroyed. So at the moment when we were trying to replace public housing with units in the private market, we had a lot less private market housing to deal with. Also, New Orleans didn't have a very large number of housing units in low poverty neighborhoods to start with. And so we have a situation where certain market conditions, the fact that we didn't have enough rental housing, the fact that not a lot of it was in low poverty areas, this really made it difficult for us to actually achieve this poverty concentration that we were trying to achieve. And then you add on top of that the additional market failure of discrimination. The Fair Housing Center locally had done some testing. Are landlords even willing to take housing vouchers? 82% of them, no. Racial discrimination in the housing market. There was testing done not that long ago of what the level of discrimination was in relatively lower poverty places, uptown, like other neighborhoods that don't have huge poverty concentrations. What is the level of discrimination occurring in those neighborhoods? 42%. Okay, so this makes it really hard for a person who has a voucher, who has theoretically the opportunity to choose a neighborhood that maybe has a grocery store. And after the storm, this was really difficult in some places because it took a while for certain neighborhoods to come back, and so infrastructure was a problem. So places where they were living before probably had even fewer services than what they had before the storm. So the idea that the voucher was going to give people this ability to access greater opportunity, this was really this was a challenge after the storm. And so that's sort of one side of the equation. Public housing demolition, replacement with vouchers, okay? The problem that I'm sort of hinting at, that I'll say explicitly, is the voucher program isn't really designed to deconcentrate poverty. So this vehicle that the government is offering, thousands of households as a means of accessing greater opportunity, it's not even designed to achieve that. I've done a closer look at kind of where people are using those vouchers now. There's still 9%. We went from like a 6% of voucher users in low poverty neighborhoods to 9%. So we've barely made any progress on that at all. And so I think there's serious challenges there. On the other side, we saw an incredible amount of exclusionary zoning happening in neighborhoods surrounding Orleans Parish. So you have 50% of your rental housing destroyed. You have demolition of public housing. What's your response? Rental housing bans. Okay, so at a time when the suburban jurisdictions could come into the breach and maybe renovate those housing units that were damaged but could have been renovated, or build new housing units that could alleviate some of the housing shortage, you saw jurisdiction after jurisdiction passing rental bans that made it that made it much more difficult for people to return, and certainly for people to use a voucher to rent a housing unit to replace what they had lost. So some of these exclusionary zoning bans are a legend. The St. Bernard Parish approach was more colorful than just sort of a straight-up rental ban. There was a restriction on the rental of single-family homes to blood relatives. And so this was not just a rental ban, but a restriction on, it was clearly designed to sort of maintain the demographics as they were before the storm. The community wanted to stay the same, and this was a situation where we had massive displacement. And so we weren't going to stay the same, but you had communities really working very, very hard to try to maintain their demographics and to stay the same. So as Professor Hopeful likes to ask me when she reads my papers, where's the hope? Where's the hope? There is hope because one has to remain optimistic when one works on decades-long patterns of racial segregation in housing. So where's the hope? The hope is that we have the tools. We have the policy tools that we can use, not just in New Orleans, but everywhere, to deal with this tendency to maintain the status quo, the tendency to default to segregation, the tendency to perpetuate these patterns. One of them is to engage in planning on a more regional level. We can look at a region and decide how much rental housing we need and try to plan for that to happen across the region, as opposed to having it become concentrated in any one place. We can administer vouchers on a regional basis so that jurisdictions, so that voucher users can move throughout a jurisdiction and move to where the jobs are, move to where the good schools are, move to where the grocery stores are. And HUD just finalized a rule this summer. It's the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing regulation, and this imposes an affirmative obligation on jurisdictions who take in billions of dollars a year in community development funds and housing funds. They have to certify that they're furthering fair housing. This has been a largely unenforced rule, or a largely unenforced provision in the Fair Housing Act. HUD passed a rule this summer that suggests that they're nudging towards a more vigorous level of enforcement. Whether it succeeds will be up to us.
I'm going to walk and talk while I get a PowerPoint up, and Catherine Mattis, who, can I get it from there? What am I going to do? Okay. Well, Patrick showed me how to do it here. And that there. Good. Excellent. Okay. I can do it from here, and this will work as well. I'm David Marcello, and I run the Legislative and Administrative Advocacy Clinic. We're rather different from the others in that we don't go to court. We go to the legislature and to administrative agencies and promulgate regulations and pass, when things are going well, legislation. We are also open to registration for second-year students, second and third year. You don't have to be admitted to practice in order to represent people in Baton Rouge. So I'm going to start with a comment about Oliver's provocative notion that you believe things before Katrina and you believe them more afterwards. Not so much me, Oliver. I mean, before Katrina, I was a big believer in government as an engine to do some really beneficial things to people. Some levels might be more effective than others, but post-Katrina, it seemed to me all three levels failed us utterly, at least in the immediate aftermath of the storm. There were certain things that were politically given before the storm that you could not conceive of being different afterwards. Those things changed. It strikes me that most of the topics we've talked about have been about the harm that Katrina did. You know, Katrina adversely impacted the environment. Katrina messed up the criminal justice system. Katrina messed up housing. Well, it also messed up government and politics, and that, in the last analysis, didn't prove to be an altogether bad thing. So 5 years post-Katrina, I wrote an article for this publication that the Brookings Institution did, and it's got that pretty picture of Katrina on the front of it, Resilience and Opportunity, and my piece of it was called Systemic Ethics Reform in the Wake of Katrina. You know, what did I mean by ethics reform? Well, I said in here that ethics reform does not mean that people start behaving better. Ethics reform means that systems are put in place to deal with people who are behaving badly. And we put 3 new local initiatives in place: an Office of Inspector General, or OIG, an Ethics Review Board, or ERB, and the Office of Independent Police Monitor, the OIPM. Like many Katrina stories, the story of ethics reform starts before the storm, well before. Back in the, well, let me first say what motivated these changes. I think 3 elements came together in a sort of perfect storm to provoke change. One is that the civic sector stepped up to the plate when it became apparent that government was not performing at its best. The second thing that changed was this disgust with government spilled over into electoral change, and new opportunities for candidates to get elected came along. And then thirdly was the fear of corruption, and anti-corruption laws were passed in order to fight the prospect that we were going to embarrass ourselves and our state in the eyes of the nation because of all the federal money that was coming here. Governor Blanco was so concerned about the administration being embarrassed that she built 20 or more anti-corruption screens into the Road Home program, which is one reason why the Road Home program didn't function terribly well. Mississippi, by contrast, had about 4 anti-corruption schemes. So I would suggest that if we had a good system of ethics in place, we might have paid less of a price in terms of fighting it with the complicated anti-corruption schemes. If you've got a system, hopefully it protects you from that. So 1994-95 is when the Ethics Reform Initiative began with a charter revision process that did 2 things: mandated the creation of an Ethics Review Board and authorized the creation of an Office of Inspector General. We thought we'd done something pretty significant. Well, January 96, these charter reforms took effect. When did the Ethics Review Board convene? For its first meeting in January of 2007. That's 12 years if you count it up using all your fingers and 2 more. And the Inspector General didn't come on board until 9 months after that. So what happened to change things? Well, you've all perhaps heard of the great man theory of history. Well, I'm here to tell you about the great woman theory of history, and her name was Shelley Madura. She was an absolute novice who decided that she was going to run for the City Council District A seat, and she unseated the incumbent council member, Jay Batt, and she made a tremendous difference once she got there. This was not a foreordained conclusion. We saw Shelley at her first presentation, and her campaign manager talked twice as long as she did, which did not present a good appearance. And I told her so afterwards. Some weeks after that, we were having coffee at the PJ's on Willow Street. And I said to her, we need to get the Office of Inspector General and the Ethics Review Board activated. If you can do that, you can roll up the sidewalks and go home. Your legacy will be complete. Well, she did, and it was. There's a series of wonderful things that happened after the elections and the inauguration, beginning in November of 2006 with the approval of the Office of Inspector General ordinance that had been authorized those 12 years before, but no one had ever gotten around to creating it. My wife and I were having dinner at a restaurant in Little Rock, and my cell phone went off, so I stepped out onto a balcony overlooking a lovely little stream, and I took a phone call from Shelley Madura. And she said, we've just passed the ordinance to create the Office of Inspector General. Can I go home now? And I said, well, not yet. And over the next period of years, we saw some ordinance revisions that strengthened it. We saw some legislation passed in Baton Rouge that empowered subpoena authority. And ultimately, we saw a ballot proposition in the fall of 2008 that committed funding to these three ethics enterprises, the OIG, the ERB, and the OIPM. Dedicated funding is absolutely vital to the independence of watchdog agencies. So I consider this a good test case for reform. 10 years after the 94-95 charter revision process, we still had no ERB, no OIPM, no reform in professional service procurement practices. 10 years of no progress with progress that transpired subsequently. I think we have to credit Katrina, as awful as it was, as being the catalyst for upsetting the established political order. So the OIG, ERB, and OIPM were what I would call institutional reforms. There are also process reforms, and we had some of those as well. Professional services procurement involves the selection of lawyers and architects and engineers. It is necessarily more subjective than the per unit cost of a pen. You know, if you want your bridge or your building to stay up, you're not necessarily going to hire the cheapest per unit purveyor of engineering and architectural services. So we mandated competitive selection of professional services in 1996. It didn't happen because there was a political decision made to bifurcate the process, council rule, mayoral executive order. It got worse during the Nagin years. The longer the executive orders got, the more vacuous and permissive they were, and ultimately, as a consequence, some people went to jail. So the sources of procurement reform were prosecutions, press coverage, resentment at patronage practices. The reality check on the Ethics Review Board performance, I'm going to subvert because time is running short. I knew when I brought this information to the fore back a month or so ago that it would not be well received. The Katrina 10-year narrative is that we've come through, we suffered a hard hit, we're doing better than we were before. By and large, I think that's true. But in some areas, reality tells us we can't ignore some hard truths. So the synergies supporting ethics reform were, I believe, 4 Ps. Prosecutions by the U.S. Attorney. Jim Letton was in office at that time. Press coverage. Public engagement, which took the form of civic activism and had a tremendous impact. 7 assessors became 1. Multiple parish levee districts that were centers of patronage became the East and West, Southeast Louisiana flood protection authorities. Changes were had. The prison size may sooner or later be reduced. We're still fighting that battle, but we wouldn't have gotten traction some years ago. So the civic sector has been an important part of the overall change, and I think most important, the political upheaval caused by catastrophe. This is a quote from John Barry in his wonderful book, Rising Tide, and although he is describing there the 1927 flood, I think it's a grand description as well of some of what we experienced in the wake of Katrina.
Do you know, am I on there?
You are there, and I think they just need to get your photos. Adam is on top of it.
We'll see.
Yeah, perfect. Now I just click this to go back and forth.
Oops.
There it was.
Oh, well.
Well, while that's being done, my name is Catherine Mattis, and I am the present director of the criminal clinic. But at the time, I worked with Professor Metzger in the criminal clinic. And I'm one of the 2 attorneys in the criminal clinic who I had my own 2,000 unnamed, unidentified, unlocated indigent criminal defendants who I was representing. So between us, we had about 4,000 if you do the math right there. So what did that, listening to Professor Metzger talk, it reminded me of the absolute overwhelming feeling that we had when we got that appointment. And by the way, the chief judge appointed us to represent all the indigent criminal defendants when we were living in our respective evacuation cities. When we came back to the clinic and we finally had students, we had to figure out how on earth could we possibly do this. And so what we did, thank you. I've got some really good pictures. And if you can't see them, they're even better. So what did we do with students? I'll sort of take one segue, because I think putting a face on this is so important. It's important to understand if you weren't here, the tragedy that was happening across the city, but certainly our connection with the folks who were in Orleans Parish Prison at the time that Hurricane Katrina struck. Students were going out and going through the papers that Professor Metzger talked about, trying to locate witnesses, and every day we'd come into the clinic and they'd have someone new. Catherine, you've got to help get this person out. This person's been in jail for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, no charges against them, never been to court. One such woman, I remember just specifically, students came to me, and I'm going to call her Pearl. Pearl has been in custody for 8 months, but she's been charged with an offense that the maximum sentence is 6 months, and she's never been to court. So we went and we found her, and we had working with us a film crew who wanted to document her release. We finally got the judge to order her release, and although that sounds like it should be a simple process, it never was. We met her. This woman had severe mental health issues, and when we decided that we couldn't just simply get her release ordered, because if she was released into Orleans Parish, there was no family left. Her family, she had no idea where her family was. There were no homes or shelters for the homeless. There's no luck?
I'm going to go see if I can find Patrick. I've got his number. He'll get it up.
There was no place for people without a home to live. She had no money, no transportation. She had no identification, because her possessions that were with her when she was arrested were destroyed in the flood. So students and I met her. We asked her if it was okay for a film crew to be there, because they wanted to document her story. And this woman, who had a long criminal history, who was jaded and had experienced so much, suddenly started sobbing in the courtroom. She said, "I didn't think anyone cared. We were locked in a prison cell. The guards had all left. The water was rising. There was no windows on the cell. My client was a tall woman. She says, I was with 3 other women. One of them was really short, and as the water rose, she was afraid that she was going to drown, so I put her on my shoulder. We spent the night in a windowless, dark room without power, no food and water, with water up to our chest. We had to use the bathroom facilities in the water in which we were standing. The next day, rescuers came and cut a hole in the roof. And our client had lost her front teeth, because in trying to get the woman who was on her shoulders out through the hole, she knocked her teeth against the metal bars of the cell. When she was told that the people doing the filming wanted to tell her story, that's when she broke down. I didn't think anyone cared. I thought they left us to die. We met her as the judge had ordered her release. We met her at the sheriff's intake so that we could take her, because this woman had nothing. We had to take her to get a Social Security card. And of course, they didn't want to give a Social Security card without proof of who she was, like a driver's license. Well, she didn't have a driver's license because it was destroyed in the flood. So students spent 2 days just sitting in the Social Security office, just sitting in the DMV, trying to get her ID so they could get her a Social Security card so she could have some identification, so that she could begin the very slow process and painful process of starting her life over again. These are the kinds of things that the students in the criminal clinic were doing. One of the students came up with a great idea, which was, we knew that all the evidence for all the criminal cases had been held in a room in the courthouse at ground level. Some of the evidence had been held in the New Orleans Police Department police station, and not at ground level, but subterranean. So one of the students had this very smart idea. We should document the condition of the evidence. We should find out and make a record of it. So we went to the judge who had appointed us to represent everyone, and we said, well, as part of our representation of everyone in the Orleans Parish Prison, we would like to document the evidence room. A BBC film crew was present in town, and they offered to be our film. Oh, look, thank you.
I'll do it this way.
Okay, thank you.
Tell me when.
Show me what, just take a pic.
All right, I'll pick one.
So these are some of the pictures we took. So we went in with a BBC film crew to film the evidence room. And the judge who signed the order allowing us in insisted that we have someone with the School of Public Health with us and that we wear hazmat suits because we didn't know about the condition. You have to understand the evidence room in the clerk's office, which is in the clerk of court, was shared space with the morgue, with the coroner's office. The time Katrina hit, there were 8 bodies in the morgue. Those bodies were raised off of the gurneys and floated around the evidence room for 2 weeks before all the water receded and the bodies could be removed. So we went into the evidence room and we, with a film crew, we went first to the clerk of court in hazmat suits. And you'll see there's a picture of me walking in with a student, and we have, there was no electricity, of course. It was hotter and nastier than I'd care to describe to you. Let's put it this way. When you stick a bunch of water for weeks and it's like about 100 degrees and no ventilation, it's amazing what grows. And so the evidence all floated off the shelves and onto the floor. It was, you couldn't tell what it belonged to. It was destroyed. Oh gosh, sorry. Okay, so I got my 2-minute mark. So we did filming of the evidence, and after that, with that information, we joined, the clinic joined with other organizations, the district attorney's office, the sheriff's office, the clerk of court's office, and we created one of the first in the criminal justice system, a network of stakeholders to revise how the evidence is maintained, because clearly the way it had been stored and maintained was completely inappropriate and unworkable even before there was a catastrophe. But as you can see from the results, I just want to mention one other thing too, because this is other really excellent work that we did with the students. When we were having the students go through all the people who were in custody, I had them all looking out for anyone who had been ordered to go to the state mental health hospital because they were incompetent, mentally incompetent to stand trial. And what the students learned is they pegged all those people. And what we learned is that at the time that Hurricane Katrina had struck, there were 25 people who were sitting in jail who had been long before ordered up to our mental health hospital, but were sitting in jail because there weren't enough beds. They were no longer represented by counsel because their criminal case had been suspended, because you can't prosecute someone who is mentally incompetent to stand trial. With their criminal case suspended, they sat in jail waiting for a bed to go to the hospital, but there weren't any bed space available. Some of these people at the time of Hurricane Katrina had been sitting in jail not for months, but for years, not getting psychiatric care, not having a criminal case prosecuted against them. In other words, they were locked up in a jail because they were mentally ill for years. And it was only because we went through those names, the students went through those names, each name, to figure out why they were in jail, that we were able to find those people, discover that problem. We ultimately were appointed as special prosecutors to prosecute a contempt proceeding against the sheriff and the secretary of the Department of Health and Hospitals. Then after that, we filed habeases. We recognized that this was actually a statewide problem that had for years been going on and no one had known about it. And we partnered ultimately with the ACLU and the Advocacy Center, filing a federal civil rights suit. And finally, the result of that was a consent decree was reached, so that now these people have to be transferred out of jail within 30 days of being determined that their criminal case can no longer proceed against them. And that work was all done with students hand-on. And I just want to close by just saying the most important thing that I got out of this is I was a litigator when I started, and that's what I knew how to do. After Katrina, you couldn't litigate anything. There were no courts. You had to figure out another way to be an advocate. And that's what I learned, and I know my students learned it, that sometimes advocacy means not just litigating. Sometimes it means community education, legislation, and all sorts of other tools that you need to gather and use in your toolbox if you want to truly be an advocate for your client. That was my takeaway from Katrina.
Professor Feidelman, can I impose upon you? I've got 2 stacks of things over here. If you could distribute those, there should be enough for almost everyone to get one here. Hi, my name is Dave Katner, and I'm the director of the Juvenile Clinic here at Tulane. And I'm the one person who's not on the program, and you won't see any pictures of me either, and I apologize for that. But I thank you. I thank you for 2 reasons. First, there are about 31 of you who came. I cannot imagine, under any circumstances, wanting to go to a program late in the afternoon and hear about a disaster. So thank you for coming and listening to us. Secondly, I wanted to be part of the panel because I thought this might be cathartic. Not for you, but for me. And I'll explain that as we get into it. Katrina, for me, was very personal. I'm actually from the Lower Ninth Ward. I grew up in the Lower Ninth Ward, and I went to high school down in the Lower Ninth Ward, which in New Orleans is a very important part of our self-identity, where you go to high school. I went to Holy Cross. Everything is gone now. The school that I went to, it's disappeared. The house that I grew up in disappeared. We lived about 6 blocks away from where Fats Domino lived. For those of you who know anything about that part of the city, it's all gone. I did have the opportunity to meet Brad Pitt twice down there. Once when I was looking at some of the new houses that he and his wife built in their foundation, and I was complaining about the houses because to me they looked awful. And he kind of came up behind me on a bicycle, and he's a real scruffy-looking guy. He's real short. And he said, "You don't like the houses?" And I said, "No, they look terrible." And I turned around and I said, Are you Brad Pitt? And he goes, "Yes, that would be me." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Look, thank you for giving us all the money to help us rebuild. I know you're not from here, but it was an amazingly generous thing." He says, "But you don't like the house?" I said, "No, honestly, really, it looks like crap." And he said, "But they're very energy efficient." I said, "Well, tell that to my friend, the environmentalist, but to me, it still looks like crap." I said, "But you know, you can get together with some good people from New Orleans and they'll show you how to build a house correctly, because that's what this neighborhood once had. We had amazing houses that were all built out of cypress. They're gone now. They're gone." I went yesterday to my mother's house, who's from St. Martinville. She moved here, and her family lived on Harrison Avenue in Lakeview. It's gone. It's gone. It's been gone for 9 years. First time I've been able to set foot back in that neighborhood was yesterday. I went to my parents' former house. It's gone. My wife and I, when we left here the day that Katrina hit landfall, my wife was 6 months pregnant. A week later, we lost the baby. But we didn't have access to medical care. We had to wait 2 weeks, and she knew that. So she had to have induced labor, which was an awful thing to go through for a stillborn child. And that was a defining moment for me with Katrina. When we came back to New Orleans, I came back early. My wife was a surgical nurse, and I would put on her surgical outfit, her scrubs, so I could get past the military checkpoints to get back in town. And I did that successfully quite a few times. And when I came back in, I came over here to school one day, and lo and behold, there was one person in the whole building. His name was Gunther Handel. Some of you may know Gunther. He speaks with a rather thick German accent at times. And he has a wonderful sense of humor, if you didn't know that. And Gunther said, "David, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to take a drive down to the Lower Ninth Ward and go see what it looks like." "May I come with you?" I said, "Yes, you may." So we're driving down, and we keep hitting these military checkpoints, and they keep stopping us. So Gunther wants to say something. And he goes, I said, "Please don't say anything. Don't say anything." And so we get past the first couple. He says, "Why am I not allowed to speak?" I said, "Because they're going to think we're some kind of conspiracy. If you say a word, just don't say anything." So we get to the last military checkpoint, and the sergeant comes over and says, "Where are you going?" I said, "We're headed down to the Lower Ninth Ward." He goes, "All right, what's your business?" I said, "I've got a business down there. I'm going to go check on it." He goes, "Okay. But first you have to speak to the lieutenant." So the lieutenant comes over, and he wants to stop us. He wants to get us out of the car. I said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "Look, we're military. We work with the military. We're first responders." And the guy looks over at Gunther. He goes, "You're a first responder?" And Gunther sort of nods his head. Doesn't say a word, thank God. And so the guy says, all right, go on through. When will we be back? I said, we'll be back in about 2 hours. So we're riding up the St. Claude Bridge, and Gunter goes, you American lawyers are such good liars. And I said, yes, we were trained by the best European minds to do this. We go in the lower ninth ward. It's complete and utter devastation. There's nothing there. There's very little to see. We could only get about half a mile in. Then Gunter rolls up the windows in my car because there had been a horrible oil spill. And Gunter says, you have to roll the windows up because we're going to die from the fumes. I said, Gunter, we've already breathed all that in. You said, this isn't going to save us. Rolling the windows, we're just going to contain the horrible fumes inside the car. Roll your window down, brother. Just let it go. Gunter and the lower ninth ward and coming back from Katrina. Good Lord. So ever since then, Gunter and I on Fridays go out for a beer, which has been a really interesting part of my development. When I left New Orleans, I got stuck in traffic on top of the I-10 twin span. My Governor Blanco and Mississippi Governor Haley put their great minds together and concluded the smart thing to do would be to prevent people from Louisiana traversing through Mississippi, because we will invariably will stop and use up all the gas, and no one will be able to get out. So 100,000 cars got stuck on the interstate while these elderly people are wandering to the side of the bridge, doing what they have to do, and it's just a complete and total mismatch. Everyone's listening to WWL, trying to figure out where we're going to go. We are stuck on the bridge. Where's the hurricane coming? It's coming up through the Lake Pontchartrain. It's going to go across Lake Catherine. We are going to be stuck over water when this thing hits. Finally, the Mississippi State Police allowed us into the hallowed ground of Mississippi. They wouldn't let us off the interstate, so we were all running out of gas. So there's about 50,000 cars that just stop. And at that moment, I thought, this is just like the juvenile justice system. We're running out of gas. We got no place to go. We got authority figures telling us go that way, and we can't go anywhere. And that is what inspired me to write an article for the American Bar Association, which is entitled, the book was Children, Law, and Disasters, and I've given copies out of some of the reprints of the article, Rethinking Juvenile Justice in the Wake of Katrina. And this is what I rethought, and this is what came to mind. The first court that opened was First Parish Court. It opened up in Algiers, which is on the West Bank. It looks like a miniature castle. It's a beautiful building. There's one judge in there, and there are 5,000 people outside, lined up around the block. So I'm the only lawyer that wanders in there. I got this call saying, we need a lawyer down here. I drive over to the West Bank. I see this line that goes it's like snaking through Algiers. I walk in. Judge Gray is sitting on the bench. She is the chief judge in the juvenile court. She calls me up to the bench. She goes, are you ready to handle these cases? I said, I don't even know who these people are. She goes, well, I've got a worse story. I'm stuck in Baton Rouge. I'm from New Orleans. Judge Gray's from New Orleans. I said, Judge, I'm so sorry to hear that. She says, no, that's not the bad part. I said, all right, what's the bad part? She goes, I'm in a trailer. I said, oh, Judge, I'm so sorry to hear that. No, that's not the bad part. I said, well, what else could there be? She goes, and my mother-in-law just moved in with us. I'm like, oh, God. So I said, Judge, we can't possibly hear any of these cases. We don't know anything at all about this. She goes, well, there's no one here. There's no one here. So we heard, I think, the first 20 cases. I have no idea. Contract disputes. I got to get back on my property. I can't find my children. My dog's missing. Significant legal events. But for the first 20 people, they were their lives, and they were of significance to them. We had 2,000 homeless kids. We were appointed, the juvenile clinic was appointed to represent 2,000 homeless. They couldn't even tell us the names of the kids. We actually started looking in houses to see if there were homeless people there. Think about that. You go under the bridge and you say, are there any homeless people down here? You become a really popular person very quickly in asking that question. There were three things I walked away from with Katrina. And I sort of took a perspective like the School of Public Health. That is, we have to think completely differently from the way lawyers think about problem solving. We have to think holistically. When HIV hit the U.S., when the pandemic came here, the very first thing we attempted to do was we got to create some sort of vaccine. Well, that didn't work. So what did the people in public health do? They said, we have to think about preventative care. And that's what the legal system perhaps would benefit from. So what's the preventative care for children? Daycare. We have at least 5 longitudinal studies that are still going on throughout this country that say if we begin education before children reach the age of 5, we can reduce recidivism rates for people who are in high-risk communities by at least 80%. And not one study has ever come up with a different conclusion than that. I think there's legitimacy, and I think it merits consideration. The second thought, longitudinal evidence of successful interventions. What do we do as lawyers? We impose our will on everyone. We tell everyone what to do. We don't ask. We don't encourage people to give us input. We just create systems. So we sentence kids to indefinite periods in jail. It doesn't work. We sentence them to 5 and 6 years in jail. They come out with the equivalent of a PhD in crime. There are ways that we can intervene in a much more successful manner. We know how to do it, but we have to ask people in social science. We have to sit down across the table with them. We have to drop the ploy of being a lawyer and having all the answers. We don't have the answers. We certainly didn't have those answers for Katrina. The third thing, kids under 16 are not legally competent. That's not my thoughts. Those are the thoughts of about 58 countries around the world. They don't prosecute kids for delinquency. In most of Western Europe, they don't prosecute kids for delinquency. They just don't do it. They think that we are barbaric, and perhaps there's some merit to that thought. There's a social science intervention strategy that can work. It works elsewhere. Read the article if interested. I'll be happy to answer your questions afterwards. The happy ending to the story is a year and a half after we lost our baby, we did have another child. We named him Noah.
Well, on that note, I've cut short so many remarkable people with their remarkable stories to save you all. It turns out to be about 5 minutes to ask questions. So if you have any questions, any punchy, short questions that punchy short answers, anything?
I move around, Paul.
Obviously, I was not here when you posted it, but your stories are remarkable. And 10 years after, how do you convey that to people who weren't here, who perhaps were too young, like a lot of the students? The import of your lessons, because they need to know that, they need to hear that, but yet not having lived through that, I'm not sure that they know that these are things they need to hear.
I can give you what I think is a litigator's response, which is we move on, right? Today, for our students now, say in the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, is today's challenges that we're worried about. So frankly, I don't feel the need to convey that. It's out there. I mean, there's lots of information about what happened, but it's always what's going on now that we're reacting to, the current clients, the current disasters or near disasters or disasters for somebody, and that's what we focus on.
I have a slightly different, Adam and I often see the world in slightly different mirrors, but we work in very similar fields. And so it's not a critique at all to say that I find a way to do what you suggest, to bring it right into the classroom and use Katrina as an example. So there are so many ways that Katrina exemplified the law gone wrong that one can put Katrina into any lesson or into any one can attach Katrina to a case we might be considering on worst case analysis. I mean, under what circumstances do you have to anticipate the very worst thing that could be happening before you make a decision? And here was a classic case of no one looking at the obvious worst case. We're going to drown. You do this, we're going to drown. Same thing happened in BP, which is another great teaching example. So I think you just bring it into the classroom.
Any other questions? Adina, do you have a question?
Do I have a question?
I'm just calling on people now. I
That's
saw you looking for the door. I thought
Anyone?
I had a bunch of questions, but I'll just get everybody's name after or something. But for David, who's the last presenter, what role does, I'm a special ed teacher, actually, and what I want to know is what role do you feel that the lack of accommodations in special ed have in creating the overflow of kids in prison?
Well, I don't think that everyone in prison should have been a special ed kid, but we still aren't providing special ed. We don't even do special ed evaluations. If you look at the charter schools, many of the charter schools are not performing special ed evaluations, not unless the parent pays for it out of their pocket. These are public schools. So what role does this play? It plays a very large role. If we cannot intervene successfully, then these children drop out of school at a very early age. When they drop out of school, what do? The rates of succeeding in educational interventions in Jefferson are far superior than they are here in Orleans. In Orleans, we should have learned this lesson long ago. I'm not sure what we've learned, but we certainly didn't learn anything from Katrina. Or at least our present actions would suggest that we've learned very little from Katrina. I'm sad to say.
Sorry, so it's 6, but your comment reminds me, I'm sure people, if you have questions, you can find all these folks on the website. Also, there's a link, a story about this that is on our website, has links to a number of the works, published works that people have discussed on the website. And these folks will have to other resources if you have questions. Thanks very much for coming and listening and being part of the panel late in the day. And thanks especially to all of you.
Thank you, Adam.